Salam alaikum, everybody. Masa al khair and good evening. Though I'm not myself Muslim, I had the great fortune to grow up in one of the great centers of Islamic learning, Cairo, Egypt. So I hope you'll allow me to start this event, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. My name is Jonathan Stuppel, and I'm the Director of Programs at the Alwaleed Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding, which is a real mouthful, so I hope you'll permit me to say ACMCU. And I'm representing tonight Dr. Nader Hashemi, Director of the ACMCU, who regrettably was not able to make it tonight due to travel for a conference on Gaza. And he wishes you his warm welcome, and he's very, very excited to be having this important event and reflection here on campus. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Alwaleed Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding. We were founded in 1993, and our founding was really in direct response to that infamous argument, the clash of civilizations, which posited that with the end of the Cold War, the next, one of the next big enemies that the West would have would be Islam and the Islamic world. And we categorically reject that argument, and we think it's deeply problematic and also fallacious. And I won't get into that, but the reason I mention that is just to speak a little bit about the mission of the Alwaleed Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding. Our mission is twofold. The first is to build bridges of mutual understanding between the Muslim world and the West. And the second is to enhance the understanding of Muslims in the West, which, as we all know, verges on ignorance. The center reflects Georgetown University's Jesuit heritage, and particularly the recognition of the importance of religion in contemporary international affairs. It's very rare for a university to put such an emphasis on the importance of religion and to acknowledge it as legitimate. And we're very grateful to be housed here at Georgetown. ACMCU faculty have taught courses, a variety of courses, such as the study of Islam, Muslim-Christian relations, Islam and the West, religion and international affairs, history of Islam, gender, culture, and Islam, the Islamic world, Islam and democracy, and a long list that I will skip here so that I don't bore you half to death. Our faculty have published hundreds of books and hundreds of articles that have been translated and published in over 55 languages around the world. Our focus is not only on Islam in America, it's not only on the Middle East and North Africa, but the entire global community of Islam, including South Asia, and we have a Malaysia chair of Islam housed at our center, and many more. The center has organized over 1,500 conferences in just the past 18 years, and tonight we're adding another very important one. And as we approach our 35th anniversary, we're hoping to continue to draw on the networks of scholars, religious and political leaders, the media and global communities that ACMCU has established across the world. And we look forward to the next decade of realizing our mission at home and abroad, and especially now during this especially difficult time with the war in Gaza. I would also like to mention for a moment the Bridge Initiative. The Bridge Initiative is a multi-year research project on Islamophobia housed within the ACMCU at Georgetown University. The Bridge Initiative aims to disseminate original and accessible research on Islamophobia around the world. We every day publish a newsletter, and we regularly publish fact sheets on politicians and important stakeholders and leaders around the world who say things or do things that are Islamophobic. And moving from that, I would just want to, again, very warmly welcome you. And we're very glad to be partnering with the Unity Production Foundations tonight to bring Dr. Sherman Jackson to Georgetown. And we would like to hand off right now to Daniel Tutt from the Unity Production Foundations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. Good evening. Wonderful to see so many friends and familiar faces for this very momentous lecture from Dr. Sherman Jackson. Before we move to the lecture, I'd like to share a little bit about why we are here. On the screen behind me, you'll see a new program that my company, Unity Productions Foundation, has just launched, which I think is actually worth your attention. In an age of social media, we hope that you look into American Muslim Pathways, which is inspired by a film that we made called The Great Muslim American Road Trip, which was aired on PBS, 3-part documentary. It got a national broadcast, and it was actually shot during the pandemic, and it is about 2 millennial-age Muslim, a couple, man and a woman, traveling the famous Route 66, where they discovered that Islam has actually, and Muslims have actually been here stretching back to the founding of this country. So what we've decided to do is bring together scholars, like the scholar you're going to hear tonight, at the cutting edge of producing research regarding the history. Now here we're talking about anthropology, we're talking about history, we're talking about ethnography, we're talking about theology, Islamic studies, the whole gamut, sort of an all hands on deck. On the website, we will have podcasts about how Islam influenced blues music, the first purpose-built mosque at a Ford Motor plant, which brought together Muslims from all different races and ethnicities, which is actually interesting because the State Department doesn't say that was the first mosque, but we claim that it was. And many other things that I think even Muslims will learn and benefit from. It's now my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Mark Ruppel, who is with the National Endowment for the Humanities, the funder of tonight's lecture series. I'd like to read Dr. Ruppel's biography very briefly and then invite him up here to tell us about the NEH. Dr. Mark Ruppel is Senior Program Officer and Program Lead for Digital Projects for the Public Grant Line at the NEH, or the National Endowment for Humanities Division of Public Programs. Dr. Ruppel's portfolio supports films, games, virtual reality, mobile apps, and web experiences, all rooted in the humanities, and he also leads the endowment's National Civics Educations Initiative. Please welcome Dr. Mark Ruppel.
Good evening. I will try to be brief. Thanks for the introduction, Daniel. I don't want to be humanities brief, which if you understand what that means, you can kick back, put your feet up, get in touch with that cousin you haven't talked to in a few years. But thank you so much for having me here. I want to say a few words about the NEH, but I think it's better if I do so through one of the projects that we funded recently that has some real relevance to this. But a bit of background with the endowment. We were funded in 1965 as part of President Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society Initiative. Alongside our sister agency, the National Endowment for the Arts, we were created in some ways to stand against what was felt at the time an anti-democratic, scientific, technologically centered society. We are a taxpayer-funded agency. It costs you just about a postage stamp per year to keep us afloat, but our aims aren't all that modest, and we try to really do things with those funds that act as catalysts within the US for larger action, for larger ways of understanding, and for larger ways of looking at the history, the culture, the society that we live in order to grow it in its own way. We fund everything at the NEH, as was noted here, from documentary films to digital games, fellowships and research, preservation efforts, museum exhibits, educational initiatives, all sorts of stuff that falls under our purview in whatever that definition of the humanities is that we push at that point. We are chaired at this point by Shelley Lowe, who is the endowment's first Native American chair. She belongs to the Navajo Nation in Ganado, Arizona, and her goals through the NEH over the course of her tenure have really been to discuss and surface what's taking place in both Native American history now, as well as what's taken place in the past. In fact, we embarked recently on with the Department of the Interior on a big initiative to catalog, preserve, and interpret the history of Native American boarding schools. So I just want to talk quickly about our founding legislation, because I think it's awfully relevant to what we do here, and we will be doing this evening and across this program. So there's an interesting quote in our founding legislation. It's one of the ones that seems to be cited the most, and it reads, "Democracy demands wisdom and vision in its citizens. It must therefore foster and support a form of education and access to the arts and humanities designed to make people of all backgrounds and wherever located masters of their technology and not unthinking servants." So while in some ways, like I said, this is a call to arms against the worship of technology and an argument for the role of the arts and humanities in civic life, I always found that first line to be a little bit off. Democracy demands wisdom. But who dictates what that wisdom is? Who decides who's learned, who's wise? Many in this country don't have access to the same resources, educational or otherwise, as their peers do. So this quote, wisdom, might seem a little bit unobtainable, and it might result in some sense in some disenfranchisement. So it always seemed to me that the more appropriate way to frame this is democracy demands agency, or democracy demands an understanding of others in order to better understand ourselves. So this is the central challenge of what NEH does. And a program like Pathways is an example of how we're approaching it. But I want to quickly outline another project that I see Pathways carrying the torch for, and one that speaks to the NEH mission far better than I can. So I've been with the endowment for about 12 years, and I was fortunate enough to come in just before the launch of a project that some of you may know of called Muslim Journeys Bookshelf. And it was part of our Bridging Cultures initiative, which was an idea and an initiative by then Chair Jim Leach, a Republican congressman out of Iowa, appointed by President Obama to lead the agency. And it was born from a simple question. What would happen if libraries across the country were given resources about Muslim histories and experiences? Books, films, educational materials, funding for public events, and were encouraged to create those programs within their communities and try to bridge deeper divides. Could the humanities be deployed in a way as a kind of civic SWAT team that fostered an appreciation among members of the American public of the cultures and traditions within the Muslim world? We enlisted the American Library Association to help us answer those questions, and the results were, in a word, astounding. From 2012 to 2014, more than 3,100 Muslim Journeys programs were conducted in nearly 1,000 sites across the country, reaching audiences of close to 500,000 in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and the Virgin Islands. The project provided 25,000 books, 3,000 DVDs, and hundreds of thousands of dollars in grants to plan community events and public discussions. Libraries across the U.S. received, many for the first time, books like Eboo Patel's Acts of Faith, Marjan Satrapi's graphic novel Persepolis, The Story of Childhood, and films like Islamic Art, Mirror of the Invisible World, and Prince Among Slaves, which was not so incidentally produced by Alex Kronmer, who you'll hear about later, and I love it when that happens. Stories that came from these programs were astounding. A tiny library in Lima, Pennsylvania, for instance, told us that, quote, by reading and discussing the books, the audience discovered a people they can identify with. And in doing so, they strongly believe that the participants' perspective of the Muslim community have changed since the series. The barriers and prejudices have been brought down, they stated, at least for a small group of people in a small town in rural Pennsylvania. For other spaces like the Beaver Dam Community Library in Wisconsin, the programs presented an opportunity for members of the Muslim community to share their own experiences and faith. A local community elder, for example, provided a unique perspective on Islamic spirituality and the common ground that exists between all religions. A Muslim area physician shared his experiences of being a medical professional and how his faith factored into his practice. A local business leader and his daughter offered insight into the acclimation process of an immigrant and growing up in a Muslim household in America. And a prison chaplain brought to light how his Muslim faith supports his role as chaplain for people of all faiths in the detention facility he works in, and how he aids all interested inmates to a spiritual path of their choosing. And some of my favorite anecdotes, because in some ways they're the simplest, come from a library in Greenwood, South Carolina. Here, a Muslim woman who wears traditional dress became an active volunteer at the library, and from what I know of it, she continues to this day to do so, because she said she realized she was wanted and welcome at the library when she saw the bookshelf exhibit. A few weeks later, a doctor came to the library and was so impressed by the bookshelf that he donated a collection of new copies of the Quran because he felt there was a better translation than the ones that were housed there. So there's thousands of stories like this, and thousands more. And while it sounds a bit Shangri-La, in some ways we learned that it isn't. Some of these programs are still running, unfunded, a decade later. There's one in the Midwest, in fact, that continues to do so because of massive community interest. So that's the long tail of the humanities and the long tail of our work. If it's done right, and if the resources, AKA the funding's there, it can be truly transformative. So for some, a program like the Muslim Journeys Bookshelf presented an opportunity to learn how to see. For others, it presented an opportunity to be seen. Of course, it's not that simple. It sounds naive to position a program like this as the cure-all for what ails this country, and the political climate, of course, is far different now than it was a decade ago. But in both cases, we can see something that gives me some hope, and something that speaks deeply to the mission of the NEH. It's the purest sense of the humanities and its ability to allow us to learn about the stories of others and turn them into the stories of ourselves, our countries, and the way that it is always in the process of becoming. So we're proud to see the Pathways Project carry on such an invaluable role for all involved, especially since the NEH is only ever a reflection of the projects that we fund. Reviewers felt the same, by the way, and they noted that this project had the same potential as Muslim Journeys Bookshelf to be transformative in the communities that host it. So from all of us at the endowment to everyone who's involved in the Pathways Project, thank you for carrying that torch. Again, we are quite honored and grateful to contribute in some part to this story. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was actually quite touching. Seriously, great work. Well, I now have the distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, who is unquestionably one of the most important Muslim American public intellectuals living today, Dr. Sherman Jackson, who is currently the King Faisal Chair of Islamic Thought and Culture and Professor of Religion and American Studies and Ethnicity at USC, or the University of Southern California. Dr. Jackson received his Ph.D. from the University of Pennsylvania, and he's taught at numerous universities, including University of Texas at Austin, Indiana University, Wayne State, and the University of Michigan. Dr. Jackson is the author of several books. Most recent is The Islamic Secular, which we had an excellent presentation on this afternoon with Dr. Hashemi, who regrets that he cannot be here tonight. In all of Dr. Jackson's books and all of his work, we have, I think, an ambition and an originality of thought that is interdisciplinary, that is shifting the discourse. Every book almost makes so many splashes, so many ripples within the discourse, not only within Muslim spaces, but far beyond Muslim spaces. One of my personal favorites of Dr. Jackson's is Islam and the Problem of Black Suffering, published in 2009, a book on the theodicy of black suffering. So we are in the presence of one of the great public intellectuals. Tonight's going to be a very special opportunity. We will have a Q&A, and I will introduce Dr. Fatima Fanuise, who is also with us. For tonight's talk, we have asked Dr. Jackson to reflect 10 years after the publication of his 2005 book.
20.
Did I say 10? I have gray hair too, I'm sorry. 20 years and many gray hairs later, Islam and the Black American Looking Towards the Third Resurrection, which I incidentally got to interview Dr. Jackson for about an hour. I'm very excited to share that interview, which is another incentive for you to visit the website. But without further ado, please, Dr. Jackson.
I'm trying to figure out how to do this. All right. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نستعينه ونستغفره ونستهديه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهدي الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي وقني شر نفسي وفلت لساني من أضل بغير حق رب العالمين وبعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله well, good evening. First of all, I want to thank Alex and Daniel and everybody who's involved in affording me this opportunity to come here tonight and speak before you. And I'm especially thankful for Dr. Fanuise for agreeing to participate in this program. I'm very much looking forward to the opportunity of actually learning from a younger generation of scholars on this topic of Islam and the Black American. Daniel mentioned that Islam and the Black American was a book that was 10 years old, and then I said 20. Actually, it's older than that. I started writing this book in the late 1990s. And I don't know if many of you know what it was like in the 1990s. There were lots of cleavages within the Muslim community that had to be negotiated. And some of them were quite toxic, as it were. And among those cleavages was the cleavage that was growing between the Black American and the immigrant Muslim community. And then there were also cleavages within the Black American Muslim community itself. So this was something of a difficult time. And it's precisely those kinds of realities and some others that I felt needed to be addressed in this book. But I also felt that some of the ways in which I was thinking about addressing these issues, particularly bringing the issue of race sort of front and center as part of a discussion not only about Islam in Black America, but Islam in America. A discussion that would bring into its fold immigrant Muslims, white American Muslims, and others as part of the story of Islam in America. And part of my trepidation, part of my fear was that rather than bringing relief to some of these cleavages by so explicitly centering race, that I might actually exacerbate some of those cleavages. And again, this was the 1990s. And the charge of takfir, I don't know if you, do I need to translate that? Excommunication was never really all that far away from any really heated discussion among Muslims. And I did not want to contribute to that. So I got more than halfway through Islam and the Black American, and I sort of got scared. And I said, I don't want to cause any blow-ups. So I stopped, and I went back, and I wrote on the boundaries of theological tolerance in Islam. And the idea there was to sort of clear the brush, to establish that while we as a Muslim community may have many issues that are contentious, that are divisive, about which we have very, very strong feelings, all right? There's a world of difference between my expressing a view that you categorically disagree with and my expressing a view, all right, that is outside the boundaries of Islam. And so I wrote this book to sort of try to mediate that, so that whatever kinds of arguments people might get into as a result of what I had laid out in this book, all right, we would also have the means of managing that in such a way that will maintain the coherence, the general coherence of the community. So this book is actually at least about 25 years old, even older than that in terms of when I first started it. Now, I've been told that I have about 30 minutes, 40 max, to speak to you tonight. And I don't know how many of you know me, but 30 minutes for Sherman Jackson, I don't know. But what I'm going to try to do tonight is three things. I'm going to try to talk a bit more about how I saw the evolution of this book. One, from my own personal perspective, what I was trying to do, what I thought I was doing. And then two, talk a bit about some of the most salient criticisms of the book. And I'm going to do that not with an eye to trying to defend myself, but for the purpose of affording you the opportunity to see what some others may have seen as being at stake in this book, all right? And then three, finally, I want to come back and sort of think out loud, as it were, about how I might, no, I'm not going to write this book. I was going to say how I might write Islam and the Black American today, 25 years later, given all of the changes and the developments that have occurred in the Muslim community. So with that first theme that I mentioned, let me begin by saying that in some ways, perhaps in many ways, I think Islam and the Black American is a book that I should both have written and a book that I was perhaps the last person to write. Perhaps I should not have written. And let me talk about why I think I should have written it. I think I should have written Islam and the Black American because of its topic. The topic was Islam and the Black American. Now, I was trained in the field of Islamic studies, all right? And that meant primarily the intellectual history of Islam, going all the way back virtually to just after the Prophet Muhammad, alayhi salam, coming all the way up through Islam's encounter with modernity, including the colonial period and all of the challenges that came out of that. And for me, my focus was things like law, fiqh, like legal theory, usul fiqh, like theology, aqeedah and kalam, the humanities, grammar, rhetoric, poetry, all of these things that made up the Islamic intellectual tradition going back over 1,000 years. And from my perspective as a student of Islamic studies, all right, this battery of disciplines constituted Islam as a lived reality on the ground. In other words, wherever Islam went, what became the lived reality on the ground was essentially these disciplines coming into conversation with the realities on the ground in the places wherever Muslims happen to end up. And this is one of the reasons that you get multiple sort of schools of fiqh or Islamic law, schools of theology, etc. And so for me, these disciplines, these constituents of Islamic intellectual history were Islam, again, as a concrete, lived reality. This was Islam. Now, at the time I decided to write Islam and the Black American, including those things that I just mentioned before, the classical Islamic intellectual tradition, and you have to remember, this is over 25 years ago when I started writing this book, all right? Almost nothing that was written about Islam in Black America, in the Black community, all right, had virtually anything in it, all right, about the classical Islamic tradition and its relationship or lack thereof to the development of Islam in Black America. And so what we have is Islam in Black America developing almost as a phenomenon that is autonomous from what Islam has always been virtually everywhere it went. And so for me, this was a question and a problem. It was sort of like, how could this be? How can we talk about Islam in Black America on the one hand, all right, and not talk about Islam as it has been transgenerationally debated and maintained over generations and thousands of miles of Muslims, all right? And so my ambition was to place Islam as I had conceived of it in terms of its intellectual tradition into conversation with the realities that made up the ongoing saga of Islam in Black America, including my place in that as a Black American Muslim. But not only did I want to do this sort of for historical reasons, the cleavage that I mentioned earlier between immigrant and Black American Muslims seemed to me to be largely based on the idea that immigrant Muslims represented that classical tradition with more authority than Black Americans could bring to any discussion of Islam. And because of that, there was a growing immigrant hegemony within American Islam as a whole. Now, for me, as someone who had studied that whole tradition, oftentimes what I found was that there was a presumption of knowledge in the immigrant community of this classical tradition, all right? But that presumption did not always pan out to be true, all right? In other words, we would presume that people who came from the Muslim world would obviously, all right, have at least facility, if not mastery, of that classical intellectual tradition, all right? And that's part of what would justify and authenticate and, legitimate their arguments in spaces that were shared by Muslims. In point of fact, however, that often was not the case. They often were not educated in that very tradition. So part of what I wanted to do is to recenter that tradition as a means of leveling the playing field between immigrant Muslims and Black American Muslims, on the idea that that tradition is accessible, open to everyone, all right? And anyone who learned it, all right, would be as authentic, as authoritative as anybody who had learned it before, all right? And so by Black Americans sort of gaining facility in that tradition, we would level the playing field and we would mitigate this hegemony between immigrant and Black American Muslims in America, all right? That was sort of my ambition. Now, I think that, I think this is a reasonable narrative to want to sort of promote. And I think in some ways, only somebody like myself, and I'm not patting myself on the back here, I said somebody what? Like myself, somebody who had that kind of training, all right, could have written this kind of book, all right? And in that sense, I think I should have written that book with the interest in mind that I just stated. On another level, however, perhaps I was not the person to write this book, all right? Because, as I said, I was trained in Islamic studies, not religious studies, not history, not anthropology, not sociology, all right, among others. And these were the dominant fields that were brought to bear on the study of Islam in Black America, all right? We have to remember, I mean, just think back to, classics in the study of Islam in Black America. I mean, for example, C. Eric Lincoln's The Black Muslims in America. There is nothing in any of these early books about Islam's classical tradition. Islam in Black America is completely, totally separate from that, all right? And this, by the way, was one of the reasons that many could sort of, look at Muslims in Black America as, well, Muslims, all right? But not really in a sense, all right? So there was very little in these books about Islam and its relationship in the Black community to what Islam had always been, all right? So there was nothing about Asharite theology, nothing about legal theory, nothing about, social theorists, Ibn Khaldun, and the whole edifice of learning that was classical Islam, all right? And even post-classical Islam, all right? Now, this raises a question, to my mind at least, of where does the study of Islam in Black America belong in the academy? Does it belong in Islamic studies? Does it belong in religious studies? Does it belong in history, anthropology, sociology? All right? All of these approaches, I think, bring along with them their specific insights, and we can benefit from them. But all of them as well carry certain shortcomings, all right, including my own, all right? I came to write the book Islam and the Black American as something of an outsider, all right, to the field of Islam and America studies. This is not something that was done generally by people who were scholars of Islamic studies. But I felt not compelled, but certainly impelled to do something because of what was going on in the Muslim community. And because I felt that it was important for Islam in Black America to get firmly established on the basis of principles through which we could navigate our debates and our visions that might be in conflict with each other in a manner that was civil and successful and hopefully synergistic and productive, all right, over the course of our future, okay? So as an outsider, I think I brought a different set of questions to the issue of Islam in Black America. But I also, there were also shortcomings in the approach that I took, and I'll talk about those in just a minute. But before, and by the way, outsiders to a field, they're often like the little boy in the Emperor's New Clothes. Am I dating myself here? Oh, you know, okay. I mean, I have to ask these days. I teach on the university campus, and things like, the Iranian Revolution, that's like last week to me. I mentioned that in my classroom. It's like, what are you talking about? So I have to. So outsiders can often be like the little boy in the Emperor's New Clothes. All right. There are all kinds of issues within a field that everybody in the field simply takes for granted. All right. And they can't see sometimes the arbitrariness by which the consensus on those issues is reached. All right? It's all simply because some big giant figure in the field stated that and nobody wants to go against them. It's not necessarily based on the merit of the view itself. All right? And we find that often outsiders then ask certain questions, all right, that bring a lot of needed change to the field. And I'm thinking about at least two people. Martin Bernal, who was a sinologist, a scholar of China studies, who wrote Black Athena, Just imagine it. He studies China, and he wrote Black Athena, and sort of revolutionized the field in terms of, well, where does all this ancient Greek learning come from? He argues there's more of a connection to Africa than has been acknowledged, all right? Or think of somebody like Edward Said. People don't remember Edward Said was a Conrad scholar, a scholar of English literature, all right? And yet he revolutionized the field of Middle East studies and even Islamic studies, all right? By raising questions and pointing out insights that others had not contemplated before then. I'm hoping that I did something similar. But again, as I said, my approach had with it certain drawbacks, and I'm going to talk about those in a minute. But before I do, I have something else I want to say. In some ways, I'm really trying to figure out how to say this gingerly, but I'm sure I'm going to fail, so I'm just going to say it. In some ways, I wish I had not written Islam in the Black American. Not because of anything that I wrote in it, which is not to say that I think that everything that I wrote in it is right. That's not the point that I'm making. But because there is still a stubborn, subtly racist tendency in America to assume that any time a black scholar says anything about anything black, all right, then the assumption becomes that that's all that black scholar can talk about, right? Then we turn to that black scholar anytime we might want to learn something about something having to do with blacks, all right, but nothing else, all right? And this is bad, not just for me as an individual. I think that I can punch my way through that, all right? But I think that it's bad for Islam in Black America because this is where we get sequestered. We're supposed to only have something to say about issues affecting blacks. I mean, it's almost as if all we care about is racism. And that if you get rid of racism, all right, we're okay, no matter what the shape of the world is. If it doesn't have racism, it's okay. Because we have no vision of the good society, all right? We have no vision of healthy political community. We have no vision about anything other than that which is relative to blacks specifically, all right? And I think that, I mean, this is exactly what I was trying to argue against. Islam has a whole tradition. It is one of the world's great civilizations, bar none. It has plenty to say about plenty of issues in society. And because its adherents happen to be black in America, which is not to say all of them are black, but because those adherents to Islam who are black in America are still Muslims and still attached to their own tradition and have plenty to say, all right? And so I just want to put that out there. And to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, I just published a book over 500 pages long, and a guy wrote me an email and said, I see you wrote a new book. I started reading it. What are you doing writing about this stuff? Basically, all right? So that's still a reality. Okay, let me move on to the second theme, some of the criticisms of the book. One criticism of the book is that it wasn't empirical enough. By that I mean that there were too many facts and figures that were well known that I didn't pay ample attention to, all right? So there, there's figures like Duse Muhammad or, Mufti Muhammad Sadiq, and just excuse me. By the way, they gave me sparkling water, so that's not my fault. All these figures who didn't play really a role in my narrative, all right? And especially for the historians, this was something of a serious flaw. all right? Because for them, my take on the evolution of Islam in Black America, could not be credible having not paid attention to so many personalities, encounters, etc. All right? I think, quite frankly, this is a valid criticism. I don't have any interest in trying to refute that as a criticism. But what I will say is that it does not speak to the issue that I was trying to get at in the explanation of the rise of Islam in Black America. My interest was not in who contacted who when, all right? But why this phenomenon of Islam takes hold among Black Americans of all the Americans in America. In other words, these personalities likely had contact with other than blacks. Whites, for example, Native Americans, other Americans. Why does Islam develop in this way that is unique in the Western Hemisphere? In fact, is unique among Western democracies. Why does Islam develop in this way among Black Americans specifically? All right? Now, of course, the assumption is that Islam in Black America is a function of the connection between America's slaves and Africa. And since Islam had a robust presence in Africa, then the African connection sort of explains the rise of Islam among Black Americans, all right? There are a number of issues with this. First, Europe is closer to Africa than America. We don't find this phenomenon in Europe. Second, any number of credible scholars, scholars who've worked precisely on the issue of Islam and the slave population and how that does or does not evolve into Islam in Black America as it emerges in the 20th century. The general consensus is that there is very little, if any, connection between America's slave Muslim population, all right, and the Islamic movements that developed in the 20th century, all right? The third sort of question, and by the way, I want to be clear that scholars debate this, all right? But there is still, I think, a view at least, upheld by many scholars, that something along the lines of 10 times the number of Africans that were brought to America, North America, United States as slaves, went to Brazil alone. All right? And yet we don't find the phenomenon that we find in the United States in Brazil. And to me, this suggested there was something uniquely American about this phenomenon. All right? There's something about America that breeds this. Okay? And I located that something in what scholars have referred to as Black religion. Now, I want to be clear about something. First, Black religion is not my invention. I did not invent that construct, all right? Whole books have been written about this by scholars who study religion in the Black community. Second, Black religion is not the same as Black American religion. Not all Black Americans who are religious, all right, are proponents of, or followers of, or influenced by Black religion, all right? Black American religion, or African American religion, is sort of the mother set of religion within the Black community. Black religion, on the other hand, is specific, and it is specifically a God-centered holy protest against anti-Black racism. Its object of worship and its appeal is to God, but to God as the explicitly great intervener in the crucible of American racism and anti-Blackness. In other words, Black religion becomes a mode of appealing to God to come and intervene and do something about the crucible of anti-black racism in America, all right? And my argument is that black religion is not a specific religion. It is a religious orientation. In other words, I can't say this because it's been crystallized, but you know, somebody can be conservative and also be what? A Democrat, no? In that capacity, conservatism is an orientation. It's a way that people incline towards certain issues and away from others, all right? Black religion is an orientation. The God of black religion is not Jesus, it's not Yahweh, it's not even Allah, but it can be all of these, all right? All right? The God of black religion can be substituted for by Jesus, by Yahweh, by Allah. My argument is that, and I lay it out in the book, based on certain developments in the early 20th century, black religion becomes much more diffused throughout the black community at large. And some of the early Islamizers, people like Noble Drew Ali, people like Elijah Muhammad, all right, they pick up on this. And that is the beginning of these Islamic movements, all right, or what I call in the book proto-Islamic movements among black Americans, okay? Now, many scholars have questioned this whole relationship between black religion and the rise of Islam. They don't like this as an explanation. One scholar says, I just don't buy this black religion stuff. Another scholar writes, and I quote, Jackson's thesis is problematic in that black religion has no independent existence apart from religions such as Islam or Christianity. Arguably, Jackson has merely reified a few salient characteristics of particularly politically active expressions of these religions among African Americans. End of quote. The reality is that, as I said before, whole scholars in the field of the study of religion in black America recognize black religion, as I have defined it, as a major religious orientation within the black community. And we might just want to think about this, just to, you know, give us a sense of how it's not just protest, it's protest in the name of religion. What did Elijah Muhammad call the white man? He didn't call him a freak or a miscreant or any number of other things that he could have called him. He called him what? That sounds pretty religious to me, all right? And so the idea of black religion as being one of the drivers of the spread of Islam among black America, to me, still to this day, has more explanatory power than any of the alternatives that are put out there. This was my explanation of, again, not how Islam necessarily continued, but how it developed in the first place among black Americans. And I think that oftentimes, even we Muslims don't realize how unique a phenomenon the spread of Islam in black America, all right, in the way that it has spread and what it has led to. We don't see how unique that is. I will say this. I think that on the day that I was born, in 19... If you had told my black American parents that one day, I'll say 56, all right, so not that long ago. But had you told my black American parents that this little black baby that they're holding, all right, one day will grow up to be a Muslim, all right, and one day the city you live in, I lived in Philadelphia, would be teeming with Muslims, that the most famous individual in the entire world would be a black American Muslim named what? Muhammad Ali, all right, okay? That they would ultimately visit my home and find their grandchildren wearing scarves and praying in this strange language, all right? okay? Had you told my parents that, neither they nor anyone else around them would have been able to believe it. And yet it happened, all right? There's something mildly miraculous about that, from my perspective, if you ask me, all right? And this is what I think explains it more effectively than the other explanations. All right, another critique of the book was that I gave too much of a role to the Nation of Islam in the evolution of Islam in the Black American community, all right? And I think that this has not been often understood in the way that I meant it. The role of the Nation of Islam and the significance of the Nation of Islam, and this is a view that I still hold to this day, and I'll say just for the record so that you know who you're listening to, I was personally never a member of the Nation of Islam. So I'm not talking about sort of the good old days, I'm talking about what I see, all right, as the actual development of Islam in the Black American community. What the Nation of Islam, in my view, was capable of doing is leading to the possibility of what I call communal conversion. And by communal conversion, I don't mean that everybody in the Black community converts, all right? But what I do mean is that anybody in the Black community who does convert is not seen as being somehow less authentically Black because they have become a Muslim. All right? Now, this may not mean mean much to many of us today, but talk to some white American converts and how the broader white American community views them, all right, as racial apostates, as cultural apostates, all right? The white American community at large does not accept Islam or recognize Islam, all right, as an authentic expression of whiteness in America, all right? It was the Nation of Islam, in my view, all right, among all of those movements associated with Islam that did more to normalize Islam in the Black American community. And in so doing, facilitating that communal conversion, all right? I remember, by the way, some of you may have seen this. I'm running out of time on it. I gotta hurry up. So I won't leave you hanging, I'll just tell you this and then I'll really speed up. 5 minutes? Okay. It's gonna, 10. Oh, 10 I can do, all right. 10. Anyway, some of you may have seen, remember Tavis Smiley? I mean, after 9/11, they used to have the State of Black America. You remember that? Some of you may remember this series. At one point, it was held in a church in Philadelphia. And I remember Charles Ogletree from Harvard Law School was chairing the panel. And he asked a question to all these Black elites. He said, what can we do? And by the way, for those of you who are not old enough, after 9/11 was a tough time in America for Muslims. All right? And Ogletree asked the question, what can we do to make Muslims feel more welcome among us? Almost before he could get the question out, the Reverend Al Sharpton jumped in and said, whoa, hold on. Let us not get caught up in the mania of the dominant culture, because there's not a person in this church who doesn't have a brother, a father, a nephew, an uncle, a daughter, a grandparent, somebody who's close to their family who's not a Muslim. So they already are a part of us. I'm not sure that could be said about any other sort of subgroup in America, right? I mean, this is the significance of the normalization of Islam in the Black American community, and I think that the Nation of Islam did more to facilitate that than any other movement. All right, third critique is that the book, in focusing on race, it sort of sought to push immigrants into this great American race game. Whereas in point of fact, they did not identify with race as an identifier. They identified with ethnicity, all right? And therefore, by forcing race onto them, race onto the discussion of Islam in America. I was sort of privileging, an experiential perspective of blacks in America, all right, and discounting that immigrant Muslims have a different reality that is not pegged into race, all right? Again, I think on purely the merits, there's some validity to that critique. But, and I think that history has borne me out, if you live in America, if you are going to do America, you are going to do race, whether you like it or not. We are a racialized society, all right? And I think that many immigrant Muslims have come out in some ways more forcefully even than Black American Muslims, all right, to recognize how America racializes populations, all right? So I think, I might be on safer ground there. I only have a little bit of time, but another critique was of gender, that I didn't give Muslim women, all right, or women period, the role that they deserved in the history or the story of Islam in Black America. I had a male perspective using male language, and I did not give adequate attention to many of the issues affecting and interesting women. Here, I plead guilty in that context, all right? There are a number of areas in which, if I were to write this today, for example, when we talk about black religion, all right, we're talking about black women in the same degree that we're talking about black men. It's sort of like when you say al-Muslimun, what do we mean? Men and women, all right? But I could and should have pointed out individuals like Sojourner Truth, like Harriet Tubman, women, all right, who sort of articulated themselves in a key of black religion as I understood it, all right? So that's, I'm guilty, all right? Let me move real quickly then to what I would do if I were to write this book over again, and I will not write this book over again. And one of the reasons that I will not write this book over again is because I think that there are a number of younger scholars who are far more qualified to write this book than I am. What I hope, however, that the younger generation of scholars will also, however, arm themselves with a sufficient knowledge of that classical tradition to be able to bring it into conversation and to maintain that conversation between that and Islam in Black America. Because Black American Islam, period, has to have agreed upon principles on the basis of which it can negotiate the differences that emerge among them. And that can't just be that I'm a male and you're a female, or that I'm an immigrant and you're black, or that I'm upper class and you're working class, all right? What are the Islamic principles, sources, on the basis of which we are going to negotiate our issues, all right? And that has to be a part of the study of Islam in Black America. Second thing, I talked about the third resurrection in that book. Now I understand the third resurrection is not enough. The third resurrection was really about Black Americans becoming more proficient in the classical intellectual tradition. I still think that that is important, but that's not sufficient, because that tradition, while giving us many rules and principles to follow in life, it also does not give us certain things such as how do we generate wealth, for example, all right? Okay? What is the best way to organize ourselves politically, socially, etc.? And so we need a lot of things that go outside of the purview of the learning of those who have mastered that classical tradition. And in that regard, the third resurrection is not enough, all right? I think we'll get into some of this when Professor Fanuise has her remarks. I would also probably be necessary to address the question. I mean, there's an argument to the extent that black religion has been thoroughly weakened, even in the black community. All right? That religion, period. is a weaker force in the modern world and in the late modern world. And one of the questions is, well, how does that affect Islam in Black America? All right? And when I say it's a question, I mean it's a question. I don't have any preset conclusions about that. All right? That's a question. Of course, I would address gender again, but one thing that I would not do, I think that, and since it's the end, I can maybe take a little bit of risk. One of the things I would not do, I would not assume that woman, and certainly not Muslim woman, you know, is the equivalent of a rights-bearing, self-determining, autonomous being of choice, all right, that recognizes no authority higher than itself as the basis for how they live life, all right? I would not equate woman with that, because I don't think that that's what Muslim woman is, all right? There's a lot of that in the academy, and I think if we're honest about that, we'll acknowledge that. I think that that is a tendency that should be avoided when we talk about women in Islam. That's one thing. Probably more attention to Imam W.D. Muhammad and other movements who contribute in important ways to the development of Islam in Black America, including movements such as hip-hop, all right? And this is one of the reasons why I'm not qualified to do this, all right? Lastly, I would probably expand on the last two chapters of the book. One, you know, the fourth chapter talks about, you know, Islam and Black America and the whole constitutional order of America. I think under the present circumstances, that would have to be expanded. There's a lot that has happened in the last 25 years. And where do Muslims stand on this whole question of constitutional democracy, all right? And how clearly and how eloquently can they articulate that? And what are the differences within the Muslim community on that issue? And how are they negotiated? All right? I think I would have to devote a lot more attention to that. And finally, the sixth chapter is about the spiritual challenge in the Black American community, all right? And I would expand that to America at large. I think that, certainly from my perspective, you know, there are issues, you know, in, you know, regarding the fraying of the moral fabric of the Black American community at large. There are serious issues. And one of the questions to be entertained is, what does Islam have to bring to bear to contribute to the rehabilitation of the moral fabric of that community? But even beyond the Black American community, all right? We can't just go along thinking that all we need to do is produce more and better laws. Somehow, we're going to have to become better people. And the question becomes, what does Islam have to contribute to that? All right, I'll stop there and try to be a good guest, and I very much look forward to Professor Fanuise's comments, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum, shalom, peace, and to everybody else in the audience, go Hoyas. I also want Daniel Tut to stand up, please, Daniel. He's been the MC for today, but Daniel has been the person, turn around so everyone can see you. Daniel's been the person who has been developing this amazing website. Now, Unity Productions Foundation is an organization, I like to say, that does big things with small budgets. And it's a relatively small budget for this amazing work, this website that's going to have video and maps. It's going to be really the go-to source for information about American Muslims. So it's going to launch really in a couple weeks. Be on the lookout for it. I think it'll become a very valuable tool. And I thank the National Endowment of Humanities for supporting it, and actually for all your kind words. And I do believe it's going to be making the difference that the Bookshelf Project made. Daniel, let's stand up and give Daniel a big round of applause. So I'm going to take my seat. What we're going to do is have a little bit of a discussion on stage, and then we're going to be asking you all to present your questions. As Daniel said, we're hanging out a little bit longer so that everyone gets a chance to fully get out of this evening what you may have come hoping for. But what I would like to begin, you know, in your earlier remarks, you've said several times that you wouldn't write this book again, but you would pass it on to younger scholars, and we have not only a younger scholar of great reputation, who, by the way, is featured in our new documentary we're working on right now that'll be aired in 2025, Islam's Greatest Love Stories. Brilliant work that you did for us in that film. So we're really looking forward to that. But in any case, you're both a young scholar doing a lot of work. You're also a woman, and he was mentioning women at the end. I didn't quite understand your point, so I'm looking forward to hearing a little more about that. But maybe you can elucidate. But why don't you tell us what the book you'd be writing or are writing now? And microphone.
Can everyone hear me?
No, yeah.
Assalamu alaikum. Yeah, thanks again, Alex and Daniel, and it's wonderful to be here. I just want to say, for the question of being a younger scholar, I was sure Dr. Jackson, Sherman, and I were talking earlier, and I was telling him, reminding him that, I don't know if he remembered, but when I was a graduate student studying, working on my master's at Tufts, a good friend of mine, a few friends of mine, we were working on putting together what we thought would be the inaugural conference on Islam in America. And this was in, I think, 1999 we were planning this, and the conference was actually, we actually put it on in 2000. And at Harvard University. And we were looking around and we were like, this is so important, the story of Islam in America, the narrative of Islam in America, and we're part of the story, you know? And so we were like, who's writing on it? And we thought of everyone, and it wasn't a big group at the time. And so we invited, and everyone we invited accepted the invitation and came, and it was Yvonne Haddad, Jane Smith, Sherman Jackson, Amina al-Dîn, who else? Imam Warathuddin Muhammad and his brother Akbar, and am I forgetting anyone? Oh, and Sylviane Diouf, right, who wrote Servants of Islam in America. So that was a very exciting time, and it's hard to believe that that was actually, the conference was in 2000, so that was 24 years ago, almost a quarter of a century, so I'm not that young. But I guess the first thing I want to say is, I am also that little boy who recognized that the emperor had on no clothes, so you can't pull wool over my eyes. And if there was a huge piñata and there were 1 million pieces of candy in it, Dr. Jackson kind of swung the bat and opened the piñata, and now they're telling me in 10 minutes, pick up all the candy. That's not gonna happen. So, but there are a few things I want to respond to. I don't think I can respond fully as a historian. I don't think there's the time for that, but I would like to speak through my lived experiences, professional and personal, and I think that that could be illuminating, that maybe we could continue the conversation that way. So there were 1 or 3 or 300 points that I really wanted to address, but I think I would start off with just maybe that question, where do we put Islam and African Americans in the academy? And, but in order to answer that, I would say, I am a historian, I'm trained as a historian, so of course I'm a little biased toward history, but I think, and I'm certain that we have to tell this narrative, we have to tell these stories with, through multiple lenses. You know, we're not going to look at the phenomenon of capitalism or women's labor or even slavery through just one lens. We're going to explore it as anthropologists, as historians, as intellectual historians, because yes, we do have an intellectual history of men and women who were enslaved in America. And so I would offer the very same thing. We should have a similar approach for attempting to understand Islam in America. And the role of African Americans in this whole narrative and discourse is central to understanding Islam in America in the 20th century and into the 21st. So that's the first thing I want to say. And then the second thing, and Dr. Jackson, I hope we have a little bit of chance to talk about this, but is that I am going to be that person who kind of pushes back on the lens of race in understanding even Islam among African Americans. And the reason I want to do that is because what you get with the Quran, what you get with Islam is a solution and a directive that is universal, that is for all of humanity. It is not for Arabs, for Africans, for South Asians, and nor is it just for people who say, La ilaha illallah Muhammadan abduhu rasulullah. And the historical proof of that is in the US Constitution, you know? You don't have the US Constitution and its whole concept of shura bainahum without the revolution of the Quran. In looking at Islam purely through eyes of race, again, even though we're talking about African Americans, I think that we do a bit of a disservice. I would like to suggest that we look at Islam through the lens of Islam and African Americans. I would like to suggest that we look at that through the lens of Islamization processes. And what I mean by that is the processes by which Islam spreads among a people, especially a people who are not literate or who are semi-literate. Dr. Jackson, although you talk about classical Islam, and I am not going to be the person to at all advocate that we don't need classical Islam or that it is not important. Indeed, it is important, and we have to continue to raise Muslim scholars. But I would argue that throughout the world, the majority of Muslim populations did not convert to Islam through classical Islamic conversations and dialogues and courses and scholarship. And that's important because to hold African American Muslims to a standard where their Islam is measured by the intellectual capital that they produce means that you're having a very different standard for the first Islamic community that developed under the leadership of Muhammad the Prophet, prayers and blessings of God be upon him, and that in his lifetime, and even the first caller to prayer. And so there's this again, I'm not going to stray into a scholarly analysis of this. I want to talk more from my own personal experiences. But for me, growing up as a Muslim child in the 1980s, my identity, first and foremost, was as a Muslim. And as a 6-year-old and a 7-year-old, I was taught that I had this destiny of Khalifa, of being, and I was taught that through the story, the Quranic narrative of God approaching the angels and telling them that he was going to create what Yusuf Ali translates as a vicegerent or a successor, or and the angels actually questioning God. And so I'd be like, 7 years old, not reading it in Arabic, but reading my translation. Wait, the angels are questioning God? And yeah, they were. They were saying, wait, hold up. Why are you doing this? This creature will create mischief and bloodshed and all of that. And of course, every Muslim child knows, that the story goes on to unfold and God says, I know what you know not. And he ask the angels to tell them the names, to tell him the names of all the things. And remember, we're not just talking names as in, simple vocabulary, but the deep, human beings without language, we aren't human, There's the, so names means naming things means the ability to create civilization. And so that was a very heavy message for a 7-year-old or 8-year-old at Clara Muhammad School, right? So I want to get back to this idea of what was Islam for African Americans, right? Islam for me was this identity that was not separate from my ethnic identity and my history and the heritage of enslaved Africans who had been brought over here of a variety of religions, not just Islamic, but it was I developed in the, I was born in 1975 under the leadership of Imam Warithuddin Muhammad. And like I said, there's so much that Dr. Jackson brought out. I can't talk to all of it as a historian, which is why I'm going to give just a little personal exploration of this. But Imam Muhammad was the son of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and I agree with Dr. Jackson 100%. You can't tell this story, this narrative of Islam becoming an American religion without telling the story of the Nation of Islam. But you can't start it even with Imam Warithuddin Muhammad, nor can you start it with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. You have to start it with W.D. Farad Muhammad, but that's just a teaser that I'm not going to fulfill because we don't have time to go into that narrative. But if we go back to Imam Muhammad in 1975, when he takes over the leadership from his father, there's something that he has said again and again and again. And again, this gets to, when we talk about the spirituality of African Americans, when we talk about whether Islam is just a protest tradition, and I have no problem with religion being a protest tradition. I embrace that, and it often is, but because we're protesting, we say La first and then ilaha illallah, but because we're protesting does not mean that we don't have spirituality, and it doesn't mean that we aren't deeply submitting ourselves to our Creator in the way that He has asked us to do in the role of Khalifa. Especially when you have an injustice that needs to be corrected, like taking God's scripture and His religion and His guidance to humanity and using that to serve your own purposes and to deny or attempt to deny humanity to other creatures or descendants of Adam. And and I guess what I'm saying is we can't, Dr. Jackson referred to how we can't get around race in America. We can't, in a way, but it is a human construction. And Islam, as taught by Imam Warithuddin Muhammad, and there's so much that I'm not going to do justice to, so there's only, I'm sounding like a scatterbrained person trying to get it all, but there are a few points that I want to get across. Islam is taught to Imam, as Imam Warithuddin Muhammad taught under his leadership, Muslims were not being given a consciousness, a black consciousness. They were given a consciousness of human salvation, of how to repair the world, if we wanted to put it into another Abrahamic faith tradition. And repairing the world in America meant that you had to flip on its head the ideology of coloring God, who has, with our human paintbrushes, right? And calling that God's will for the world. And that's what was happening, not just in America, but across the world, especially as European colonization took off. So I want to say one other thing. Imam Muhammad was also someone who, and this is something, again, anyone who has listened to him or studied, and there's a wonderful Turkish scholar who actually took him seriously and wrote about him for his dissertation out of the school in Connecticut. I can't remember the name of it. Hartford Seminary, yes. Timur, yes, thank you. But he has said again and again, as part of his coming of age narrative, that when he was a young boy, maybe 13, 14, and now I'm speaking to the 13 and 14-year-olds in the audience, which include my daughters and nieces, but that he made a prayer. And that prayer was, and I won't be able to recite it verbatim, but it was something along the lines of, "Oh Allah, if I am not seeing you correctly, then please help me to see you correctly." That's a pretty deep prayer for a 13 or 14-year-old to pray, whose father is the leader of the entire community, or I should say the biggest community of Americans who called themselves Muslim in the 1950s or 60s. These are disjointed pieces of candy from the piñata, y'all. You might be able to follow along, you might not. I'm not even going to try to connect it for you. The other thing I want to say is that, again, going back to 7 or 8-year-old Fatima, if you had asked me my ethnic identity, and I don't even want to give the answer, I want to look at somebody else who was in this community, you know, when I was 8 or 9, if you had said, okay, you're Muslim, yeah, you're American, yeah, well, what is your, my response to you would have been, exactly, can you say it again? Bilalian. So Imam Muhammad was, when we talk about connecting a Muslim people in America to Islam, Imam Muhammad was connecting African-American Muslims with Bilal ibn Rabah, the first muezzin or caller to prayer for the entire Muslim community. Oh, and he was also enslaved, right? And he was of African descent, Abyssinian. And this is a tale that, like, I talked about the whole Quranic narrative and the angels and what that did for a 7-year-old Fatima, but that was another one, you know? Well, you know, we would watch Muhammad, Messenger of God at Clar Muhammad School, and that scene, you know, depicted by an actor with Bilal lying in the hot desert sun with a huge stone on his chest because his master has asked that he give up belief in the one God, and he continues to recite the Shahada, and when he can't anymore, he only raises one finger weakly, you know, Ahad, you know, he's saying the one. So that was something that kind of, you know, we didn't have problems with legitimizing ourselves as Muslims. We were not looking for legitimization from an authority from another Muslim land. And I think it's really important to understand that. I feel badly that I'm not going into a historical discussion right now and that I'm only giving you pieces of my own scattered personal narrative, but because there's so little time, I just want to kind of throw out a few things to kind of agitate the thinking a little bit and just to give you something, especially the young people who are here, and I'm so glad to see so many of you young folks out here. When we think about how Islamization processes occur, always just try to remember that Islam does spread through the classical traditions, right? And you do have the ulama, you do have the learned men who we need to know how we make salah and other things, you know? But you also have those wandering Sufi mystics, right? Those travelers who are concerned with the people who are at least economically on the peripheries of the society. And Dr. Jackson, that question that you asked at the end about how to get that economic development going, I feel that question. And I think that the answers are always in the scriptures, you know, and that's all I'll say on that, because I don't know how much time we have, and I hope that I responded to a few things, even though I didn't necessarily do it in an academic way, and would love to hear some of your thoughts.
Before you do, first of all, that was amazing, and you know, I'm a storyteller, and I feel that I want to thank you for being willing to tell your story and how these things connect to you, not completely just academically, but personally. So thank you for that. I want to be mindful of your questions. I want to know, just raise your hands, how many people in this room have questions that they want to ask? All right, so I have an idea of how long we can have this conversation going on. I saw you made a lot of notes. Pick one and expound on it.
Well, first of all, am I on? Yeah. First of all, and I mean this very sincerely, far more than just responding to what you said, I'm really very grateful that I was able to learn some things from what you said. Among them, even if it's that certain things that I articulate may be taken in a way that I don't mean them to be taken, and I need to modify the way that I articulate them. And the one comment I would make in that regard is that pick one.
Yeah.
Oh.
Good.
Pick one. I agree, and I hope I didn't give the impression that the future of Islam in Black America or in America, period, is entirely dependent on the carriers of the classical tradition. That is not what I intended. That is not what I believe. It is always the people on the ground who translate the values of Islam or any other religion into a social order that becomes the norm for the people. And part of, the whole 500 pages that I wrote in my latest book, it's about recognizing the importance of things that are outside the confines of that classical learning, but still within the circumference of Islam. And so I think I was not arguing that Islam always spreads through the classical tradition, not at all. The point, however, is that once you have a Muslim community, and I think this is where, and it's a matter of differences of perspective, all right? I think that historians and anthropologists tend to be, if I understand them correctly, tend to be more interested in the is than the ought. In other words, what are people doing on the ground, all right? As a scholar of Islamic studies, I'm interested in that, but I'm also interested in how that is mediated through understandings of the ought. In other words, how does what we are doing relate to what we should do, and how do we understand what we should do? And who has the authority to determine what we should do? So all of that is a part of what I'm talking about, and I don't believe that Islam is spread primarily by scholars, all right? I wasn't introduced to Islam by a scholar.
Thank you for that. We're going to now pass it to you all. And I think what we're going to try to do is go back and forth. So first of all, anybody have questions for Dr. Fanuise? Would you come to a microphone, or you can stand up and shout it? How many people have questions for Dr.? Oh, no, they want to be on microphone because we're recording this. That's right. So would you please come to the microphone? Yeah. And anybody on this side, come to the microphone. Anybody else have a question for Dr. Fanuise? So what we're going to do, we're going to take about 3 questions together, and then that way we can get through maybe more of them. So you ask a question, and you ask a question. We'll have one more on this side, and then you take it away. Go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Salih Abdurrahman. I'm a junior computer science major coming from Howard University, hailing from Baltimore, Maryland. I'm also formerly one of Dr. Fatima's students at Claire Muhammad School in Baltimore. My question for you, a lot tonight has surrounded the Nation of Islam and the coming of Black Americans to Islam. And I wanted to know, if possible, could you expound on any links to Islam that we found, like, formally to that? Because I think that a lot of the time in explaining the situation, we kind of just go from Nation of Islam to Sunni Islam or whatever else it may be. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to hold on to that one. Go ahead. What was your question?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah that you...
Can you speak into the microphone? There we go.
Alhamdulillah that you, being a second generation from the Nation of Islam and having gone through Claire Muhammad, I think that when you look at Islam in America and you see how many years, and to hear your expression, the future is extremely bright, because the Nation of Islam essentially brought us to the point where you could be born. Alhamdulillah.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I came to this country in 1967, and by 1968, I was telling African Americans that they should embrace Elijah Muhammad's program. And they said, oh, we are not Muslims. I said, no, the economic program. And that's why the civil rights failed. It hopped on one leg, the political, instead of embracing Elijah Muhammad's economic program.
All right.
By the way, that's my daughter-in-law.
Oh, all right. All right, so we have several questions actually on the Nation of Islam. There may be more of those. Why don't you try to stay within 3-4 minutes so we can get a few questions for Dr. Jackson.
So, Sully, it's so
You need a
mic.
mic. And I'll give you a 30-second.
Solly, it's so wonderful to see you. I'm glad that you're here, and I'm going to first recommend that you do read Dr. Jackson's book because he talks about some of that. Along with Richard Turner's, quickly, Islam, Nation of Islam, your question was, what is the connection between Nation of Islam to the emergence of Sunni Islam? I don't see him.
Yes,
Yeah.
that was the question. 2 minutes. You did it on camera. You can do it here.
No, the problem is that I, drum roll, don't see myself as a Sunni Muslim. I just see myself as a Muslim. But if you mean what is the connection between the Nation of Islam and just the living of Islam according to the Quran and the Sunnah and Uswa of Muhammad the Prophet, prayers and blessings of God be upon him, then I would say it was a relatively short trajectory in the global context of Islamization processes, where people go from something that is proto-Islamic and pushing them to Islam to something that is mainstream Islam. And so I think it was a process that happened within 30 or 40 years, and subhanAllah, that's amazing. But the Nation of Islam, since I have 10 seconds left, I'll just throw at you my honors thesis as an undergraduate student at Lincoln University. The Nation of Islam in America was a stepping stool, both deliberate and pragmatic, in the development of Islam in America. So it was part of the evolution of a religious community of Muslims in America.
Beautiful. And by the way, she does talk about that in our film, Islam's Greatest Love Stories. So if you want to hear more about that, tune in sometimes in 2025. Let's get a couple of questions for Dr. Jackson. And by the way, there is a reception. It's just down the hall in room 270. You're going to be there, right, Dr. Jackson? Would you have time to be at the reception for a little bit? Yeah, so you'll have time to ask your other questions. If we don't have time in this forum to get your questions, they'll be available at the reception for a few more. I'll look at that long line. So what we're going to do, okay, look, we've got 10 minutes. I'm going to ask anybody who actually has a question to ask a question and not to make a comment or a statement, so we can get as many of you as we can and let Dr. Jackson respond. So question number one.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. My question is actually for both. I didn't get to the mic fast enough. But if we look at the Hadith of Jibril, Islam, Iman, Ihsan, related to, some people related to fiqh, aqidah, tasawwuf, and if we relate that to how Islam is progressing in America, do you think that what that next step is in that, if this is how you think, if you agree with what I'm saying? And so I think that we're into, as far as a community, we should be stepping to the level of ihsan. If that's the case, then what do you see the next step is, and what our generation, and the next generation should be doing?
Thank you. Next question.
Yes, thank you. My name is Baron Jamal Musa. Assalamu alaikum. My question, succinct, is not an easy one, but I would like to hear anybody's thoughts, particularly about the art that Dr. Jackson brought up. How do we reconcile Islam in America, meaning that you're coming from a paradigm of divine revelation in the context of a secular democracy?
Good question.
Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon to you all in the audience. So my question was really about black religion as opposed to, or contradistinction to, Black American religion. And the question quickly is just, how is black religion, as you described it, in any way different from the religion of the children of Israel in Scripture?
Good. Let's have one more sister. Go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Anissa Lawrence. I'm an undergraduate student at Howard University, currently the president of our Muslim Student Association. My question is for you, Dr. Jackson. You spoke about, the Nation of Islam and that being one of the criticisms of your book. And I think as young Muslims, me being a part of the Waqti Muhammad community, like how as young Muslims can we kind of shed light to the benefits of the Nation of Islam with so many negative connotations out there?
Thank you. All right, so, Dr. Jackson, you see 3 people wanting to ask another question. So if you can respond to these questions in 3 minutes, they're going to get a chance to ask you all one more question.
All right. I got to say one thing, though, because it seems that I may have misrepresented myself in giving the impression that the progression of Islam in Black America goes somewhere, Nation of Islam, Sunni Islam. That's not what I meant to imply at all. There are Sunni Muslim communities in America prior to the Nation of Islam, all right? The Nation of Islam is not the beginning of Islam in Black America, and that's not what I intended to imply. But in terms of the normalization of Islam in the black community at large, in my estimation, that tends to start with the Nation of Islam. Sunnism is not dependent on the Nation of Islam. And I think that, I wrote this book. I'm from Philadelphia. I was not in Philadelphia when I wrote this book. Mm-hmm. And I think that had I been in Philadelphia, there would have been a lot more pushback because Sunnis would have resented even the slightest suggestion, even the slightest thought that Sunnism would be a product of the nation. That's not what I implied. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about the normalization. Mm-hmm. I'm not talking about the normativeness.
Yeah. What about the question, Islam and a secular democracy?
You had to raise that, right?
Yeah.
Well, I just wrote a whole book in which, you see, one of the things, you talk about not being able to get into it, but one of the things that we have to, I think, one of the things that I argue is this, is that Sharia, based on that divine guidance, dictates lots of things, all right? But there are other things that Sharia does not dictate. Sharia can say that it's halal to do X, but it won't tell me whether X is beneficial to me or not. That we have to figure out on our own. Mm. And that means that not everything is a matter of explicit divine guidance. Mm. And I think that we should not fall into the trap as Muslims of believing that we can divide life into the secular or the religious, as if there were some place where God can't see us. Mm-hmm. All right? Great. So we're always dealing with the religious, all right? Some of the religious, however, is directly dictated by those divine dictates. Other aspects of the religious are left to us in our religiosity, all right, to deliberate the best manner of proceeding.
All right.
I hope that at least goes somewhere in answering your question.
You did it. We now have time for the last questions, but now it's up to you. It's got to be a question that's 10 seconds long, or I'm going to cut you off, all right? I'll ring the bell. So 10 seconds, and we're going to get everyone to get theirs in. So you first.
Time constraints are Islamophobic. I would like it to be on record. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Jazakallah khairan. Thank you all so much for your efforts and for making these very difficult matters simple. My question is, in continuing to connect this book with the most recent book that you've published, Dr. Jackson, I'm halfway through it. It's very good, The Islamic Secular. In it, you talk about two different paradigms, Islam, Sharia minimalism and Sharia maximalism. And I'm really interested in, especially in light of this book, do you think Black American religion is more Sharia maximalist or Sharia minimalist? And which, if you see any trends on where it's going, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Good job. Okay, the sister.
Assalamu alaikum. So my question is to Mr. Jackson. How can you live in rationalized society and have the Black consciousness or any other kind of consciousness that comes from human experience and culture, and at the same time not fall into these human constructs of classification and all these boxes that are put for you, and live the real, as Muslim Americans, the universal version of
Great.
Islam. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll take two from this side.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm Ben Abdul Haq, and I want to thank all three of you. But I'd like to hear you all respond to something very simple. I was a member of the Nation of Islam. I was a member of a Sunni community, and I stayed with the Nation of Islam. Then I stayed with Imam W.D. Muhammad. But in the Nation of Islam, we rejected the term Black Muslim. We didn't want to be called Black Muslim. I'd like for you all to elaborate on that.
Okay, so I think we had a few questions for you to deal with, and I think we had a Nation of Islam question for you to deal with. So we're gonna let Dr. Jackson once again. We're putting you under time constraint. Islamophobia, sorry, but. Oh, there's one. Okay, we're gonna let the sister have the last question, and then you're gonna have the last word in the question and answer.
This is for Dr. Jackson, but actually it can be maybe answered.
No, it's for her.
Both of you. Okay, you pick then. So my question is, you talk about how Islamic classical tradition develops not theoretically, but looking at on the ground what people do, and then it actually takes from them and then becomes a tradition by looking again how people practice it, and then becomes a tradition. So which is, I think, is missed by a lot of people who are maybe you can say the immigrant communities, but it is something that is missed and then thought as if Islamic classical tradition is something fixed, the Sharia law is something that is fixed and not flexible. So my question is, when you talk about normalization of Islam among Black Americans, I was just thinking, do you think it is possible, or the role of the African American Islam in normalization of Islamic tradition as flexible?
Okay.
That is actually, does it make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you. All right, so we're going to throw it to you first, Dr. Fanuise, and then Dr. Jackson. Play clean. Mike, you need a microphone. You need a mic. There was a Nation of Islam question, too.
What was it? So come on, like 90 seconds. So there was actually I know I promised I wouldn't say this, but just because I'm tagging on to that last question that was posed for Dr. Jackson, there was actually an Indian Muslim responding to Christian missionary movements in what was British India at the time, who invented a new identity for himself in order to circumvent the authority of the ulama in the Punjab region of northern India. And I think what is interesting is that some of his efforts actually crossed the Pacific and into the United States and the Atlantic and surfaced as Islamic communities that African Americans were receptive to. And out of some of those communities, you also have the Nation of Islam, and then the leadership of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and then the leadership of Imam Warithuddin Muhammad. And Imam Muhammad is someone who, when he sent his students to study from Muslims, to study Islam, he did not send them to the gatekeepers of Islamic orthodoxy. They weren't going to Al-Azhar. They weren't even going to Saudiya. they were sent to his buddy, Sheikh Kuftaro. So you're going, so I think that if you talk about, and I can't talk about this intelligently, Dr. Jackson will do more justice to your question, but the elasticity and the Olympian gymnastics that are needed to answer that question about secularism and divine knowledge and scripture in this modern moment that we live in, I think that you'll see that, inshallah, that some of that is actually happening right now.
Yeah.
That's all.
I just want to make one comment before you. So first of all, there's no one standing at the mics, so you actually are not under a super time constraint. I'm sure people want to hear what you have to say on these topics as much as, so you can talk, I would say, for maybe even 10 minutes if you want to, and then we'll be done. But before we do that, I want to just make one comment. First of all, I really like you, and no, I really do. And I want to say that you said something that really struck me earlier, which is looking at, if you speak about African-American Islam, that's the only thing you get known for. I've probably attended a dozen of your lectures, and this is actually the first one I've ever heard you speak on that topic. I've heard you speak on so many other topics, and if you haven't heard him speak on other topics, you really need to check out the other books and check out his lectures, because I've learned so much over the years from you, and I just really wanted to make that comment. Now, take it away. You wrote down the notes. You know what the questions are.
No, I was just thinking about responding to that, but I'll forego that. I'm going to try and take them in order. I can't do all these justice, and I just apologize beforehand for that. The question of whether, the question of Islam, ihsan, Islam, iman, and then ihsan, and then whether we are on the precipice or we should be on the precipice of sort of graduating to tasawwuf. I think that tasawwuf is an orientation, and not all forms of spiritual education in Islam are necessarily tasawwuf. And ihsan is not necessarily tasawwuf. So whether Muslims in America, and Black American Muslims in particular, since we're talking about that as a topic, sort of embrace tasawwuf, I think that will be dependent on a lot of factors. I think, though, that issues of authority in tasawwuf, as an organized pursuit, I think those issues will have to be negotiated out in a Black American context, and I'll just leave that at that. What's the difference between Black religion and, I think the children of Israel? I think that there is perhaps some overlap. They're definitely looking for God to intervene in this crucible of anti-Hebrew sort of bias. But I'm not sure that it is as protest-oriented. Am I understanding? I may be wrong. But I don't get the sense of it as being as protest-oriented as Black religion is. Certainly if we take what is expressed in the Quran, go into the city that God has earmarked for you. We not going in there. There's some big, gigantic people in there. You go, Moses, and you fight. We'll wait here. And that doesn't seem to be quite consistent with the ethos of Black religion. But I think that the general sense of an appeal to God to intervene in the crucible of this very specific people, I think that is perhaps a common trait between the two. Go ahead.
Just one thing.
Yeah.
Just one thing. We can't get stuck in using that word belacking to describe the whole religion. Even, I know you make a distinction. Belacking to describe the whole, but I know you make a distinction between
wait, I didn't hear
the religion and the yes, because
whoa, belacking? What's that?
It's just black, to be lacking of color, of absence of light, anything, anything. But that's not my point. What I want to say is that the distinction, we just can't. Howard Thurman, Mordecai Johnson, all of them still come out of this same religious tradition. I'm aware of the distinction that you make in the book between, what is it, black protest and black religion, but I don't think that the distinction can be made as neatly as you would like to make it. That's it.
As neatly?
Yes, I don't think it, maybe that's too.
I'm not even arguing for a neat, a neat distinction. I don't think there's a neat distinction between when a man is awake and when he falls asleep. But there is such a thing as being awake and being asleep. That's all I'm saying.
I guess then I'll go further. I don't think that it's a fair description of the religious impulses and strivings and spirituality of a people who have, since the time they were collectively looked at as a people, have constantly been part of the spiritual soul and moral leadership for an entire country.
Okay, but can I push back a little bit?
Yeah,
No,
but
no,
then
no.
I feel we're unfair to the question. There's a great question you have to answer. Yeah.
But he said I can talk as long as I want.
You started it. You started it.
Okay, I did. Yeah.
No, the only thing that I wanted to say is that I hope that I'm not somehow communicating the idea that spirituality and protest are mutually exclusive or somehow mutually contradictory at all. All right? When Bani Israel, all right, who are Muslims, by the way, in the Quran, when they are criticized for not willing to stand up for their right to what God has promised them, they are criticized on grounds of iman, on spiritual grounds, religiosity. Right. So the idea of protest, or activism even, and spirituality are not mutually exclusive. You have masters of Sufism who die in jihad. So from the perspective of Islam, there is not this dichotomy between protest or civic involvement and spirituality.
All right. Turns out I just got a signal that we got to end. But listen, wait a second. Hold on. First of all, I let everyone ask their questions, so you got to give credit for that. Down the hallway in room 270, there's a nice intimate room with food, and you can keep asking questions to these both brilliant people. How's that? That's a good deal, right?
Well, do we get like 30 seconds to say whatever residual?
Yeah, can you just answer though? There was a great question.
30 seconds.
Wait a minute.
I've heard you speak for 20 years. You've never said anything in 30 seconds.
Right.
Do you think you can do it in 30 seconds? Let's challenge him. Someone get a timer. Okay, you ready?
So which
Go.
question? Which question is the last one?
I want to hear the modernist challenges in religion and all that.
All right, modernist challenges to religion in 30 seconds.
Well, okay, two points. I think for me, the real challenge is somehow how we as Muslims, and this to me, and I've if nothing else, I've been honest and open with you all night about where I'm coming from. All right, and I think for me, the challenge is, can we somehow either pierce through or circumvent all of those categories and constructs that form the modern mind and somehow make it back to a discourse that is based on the Quran and the Sunnah and people who are deeply committed to that, discussing, debating, refining those discussions over generations of Muslims themselves. Can we get back to that, all right, as the mental formation through which we then go out and view the world? That's the real challenge that I see. And I don't think that, it will vary in degree, but I'm not sure it varies in kind between Black American and any other Muslims.
All right, well, that was close to 30 seconds, so let's give them both a big round of applause. Let's give the National Endowment of Humanities a big round of applause. And Unity Productions Foundation. Thank you all very much. Come join us for food and more conversation.